Mysterians believe that we will probably never know how conscious experience and the physical world fit together. In other words, the true explanation of subjective experience, whatever it is not something that we could appreciate. As Colin McGinn put it, consciousness indubitably exists and it is connected to the brain in some intelligible way, but the nature of this connection necessarily eludes us. There's also a weaker form of Mysterianism, which we'll get into a bit later. Both are reasonable in my view, but the more uncompromising version is the one that I find attractive. Mysterianism seems a bit defeatist, but it nonetheless may be true. There are times when our minds bump up against their cognitive ceiling, and explaining consciousness could be one of those times. We may never get an intuitively satisfying answer to this question, just like I'll never have an intuitively satisfying answer to whether the universe is infinite or finite. To me, both possibilities seem equally hard to concretely imagine. Maybe I'm asking the wrong question, or maybe I'm like a golden retriever trying to grasp the concept of a prime number. Either way, I'm not going to get a really satisfying answer. No doubt there are truths that simply cannot be grasped by the human mind. Given who we are and how we got here, why would we expect anything else? Our intuitions evolved to help us survive and reproduce as social animals in our environment. They're mostly trustworthy within their domains, but that's just it. They have domains. Our minds are not unlimited and did not evolve so we could understand everything. In fact, you might have been selected against had you been walking on the savannah contemplating the nature of the universe, rather than paying attention to the more immediate goings-on in your environment. As Steven Pinker put it, the brain is a product of evolution, and just as animal brains have their limitations, we have ours. Our brains can't hold 100 numbers in memory, can't visualize 7-dimensional space, and perhaps can't intuitively grasp why neural information processing, observed from the outside, should give rise to subjective experience on the inside. This is where I place my bet, though I admit that the theory could be demolished when an unborn genius, a Darwin or Einstein of consciousness, comes up with a flabbergasting new idea that suddenly makes it all clear to us. End quote. The weak Mysterian, or temporary Mysterian position, holds out some hope that some future revolution will show how to close the explanatory gap. And one who holds this moderate view says that what may look unbridgeable in principle is really just an impermanent roadblock. We may not have anything approaching a satisfying explanation of subjective experience now, but we could in the future. We should keep trying. This is optimism of a sort, but it shouldn't be misinterpreted as validation of any of the existing options, which any Mysterian will regard as inadequate. What we need is a paradigm shift. To quote Josh Weisberg, such massive conceptual reordering is certainly possible given the history of science. And indeed, if one accepts the Kuhnian idea of shifts between incommensurate paradigms, it might seem unsurprising that we, pre-paradigm shift, cannot grasp what things will be like after the revolution. But at present, we have no idea how the hard problem might be solved. End quote. The stronger form of Mysterianism, the kind associated with Noam Chomsky for instance, is far more pessimistic about gaining anything like a complete understanding of consciousness, as well as other mysteries that fall beyond our cognitive purview. Quote, "The new Mysterianism, I believe, is misnamed. It should be called truism, at least for anyone who accepts the major findings of modern biology, which regards humans as a part of the organic world. If so, then they will be like all other organisms in having a genetic endowment that enables them to grow and develop to their mature form. The endowment that yields scope also establishes limits." End quote. According to Chomsky, there is a conceptual distinction between problems and mysteries. There are many problems which fall within our cognitive capacities which may be difficult but are solvable. On the other hand, there are mysteries, which fall beyond the finite domain of our cognitive capacities. Problems are things we could solve, but mysteries are insoluble, inexplicable to the minds of human beings, just as general relativity is inexplicable to the mind of a raccoon. Mysteries are species relative. What's a mystery to a Martian might not be a mystery to us. It should be noted that for something to rise to the level of mystery, it doesn't need to be inexplicable in principle to all hypothetical beings. They wouldn't have to be inexplicable even to God, for instance. Whether there are any mysteries in this superlative sense is an interesting question, but a belief in the rationality of the universe leads me to think that any apparent, in-principle mysteries are really the product of badly formed questions or going beyond our limitations. For our purposes, we don't need to take a position on whether there are in-principle mysteries in nature, only whether there are mysteries as far as human beings are concerned. Since we're organisms produced by evolution, we have a cognitive structure that has a scope and limits, just as our physical structure has a scope and limits. We can run, but we can't fly. We can solve mathematical problems, but we can't solve the hard problem or establish a satisfactory theory of consciousness. Or so the Mysterian argues. One caveat worth noting, even if one accepts Chomsky's conceptual distinction between problems and mysteries, given the difficulty of figuring out which questions are which, problems or mysteries, it may be best to methodologically pretend that there are no mysteries. We could mistake a problem for a mystery and fail to pursue what could have been a fruitful line of inquiry. Talk about insoluble mysteries may discourage exploration that could be useful in ways that we couldn't have predicted beforehand. If we took the Mysterian attitude in other areas, some things would never get done. In practice, the question of how to identify mysteries is about as vexing as the mysteries themselves. Of course, this practical demarcation problem doesn't change the fact that there are mysteries, as far as we human beings are concerned, and that we are biological organisms with a certain cognitive and physical structure, structures which have domains of applicability and inapplicability. After all, what's the alternative? That we have infinite godlike intellects with literally no limitations? In practice, it may be difficult to identify mysteries. We'll never know for certain if our mystery is a false positive. This, however, does nothing to undermine the claim that there are mysteries, nor does it support the contrary claim that we have limitless, godlike intellects whose domain of applicability is the entirety of nature. That, as Chomsky argues, is a straightforwardly anti-evolutionary claim. Unlike Mysterians, I think there are plausible options on the table. I rank some kind of dual-aspect monism first, for example panpsychism, though I think some consciousness-only monisms can also be squeezed into this category. Second, some version of dualism, and strong Mysterianism third. So to be clear, I'm not defending Mysterianism as my first choice. Nonetheless, I think it's a far more plausible idea than flat-footed reductive materialism. Assuming we're playing the game of the metaphysics of consciousness in the first place, I think we have three broad options. 1. Unify mind and matter in some kind of intelligible and satisfying way. Separate mind and matter in some kind of intelligible and satisfying way. Or recognize that there will never be an intelligible and satisfying resolution to this problem. I spend the most time exploring option 1, defending my preferred way of unifying mind and matter and criticizing the more mainstream ways of doing so. In other words, defending panpsychism and criticizing physicalism. Trailing behind in second is option 2, separating mind and matter in some kind of intelligible and satisfying way. In other words, dualism. But what about option 3? Mysterianism, I think, has something going for it. There certainly are mysteries, as far as we're concerned, and accounting for consciousness may be one of those mysteries. But why think we've stumbled on a genuine mystery here? It could be the case, but why think it is the case? One motivation for Mysterianism stems from a dissatisfaction with existing theories of consciousness, and perhaps glimpsing what appear to be in-principle reasons that certain problems cannot be resolved. After being left thoroughly unimpressed with each option in the metaphysics of consciousness, one might reasonably conclude that the entire enterprise was doomed to begin with. As explained by Chomsky earlier, our minds have limited domains, and there's no great reason to expect understanding the metaphysics of consciousness to fall within our domain of understanding. So if you've ever found yourself thinking, these are all terrible options, then Mysterianism might be for you. And if you go way back to the earliest panpsychism episodes, I explicitly frame panpsychism as the best of a bad lot. So this isn't really a new leaf for me. Even when I was a physicalist, I didn't think any of these options were great. Well, maybe they do all suck, and maybe there's a reason for that. But Mysterianism doesn't need to be framed negatively. We could just as easily reframe it positively. Everyone makes really convincing arguments against opposing views. When materialists level objections to dualism, they're right. They're offering good arguments, at least some of the time. When non-physicalists level objections to physicalism, they're right. They're offering good arguments, probably more than some of the time. Rather than thinking all these options suck, you could just as well think that everyone is making cogent points all around. There are good arguments against materialism, and against dualism, and against panpsychism, and so on. There are really compelling reasons to reject each of these options. Maybe there are deep, in-principle reasons we can't come up with a satisfying explanation of consciousness. Of course, if you are satisfied with some option, then don't let me rain on your parade. I'm only explaining what the motivation for Mysterianism might be. But if you find yourself in the state of mind, as I sometimes do, that there are no good options on the table, then Mysterianism begins to seem very attractive. What are some other reasons one might be a Mysterian? I've heard it suggested that there may be a catch-22 at work here. Our brains could never evolve to be sophisticated enough to understand themselves. We can understand simpler creatures, but we can't turn our own cognitive capacities inward and gain a comprehensive understanding. In order to understand our minds as they currently exist, we'd have to become significantly more advanced minds, and at that point, we'd still not be able to understand ourselves. So that may or may not bear on the hard problem, or whether consciousness is physical or non-physical. The basic aim here is just to establish that there are some limitations to our inquiry that cannot be overcome by human minds. For one reason or another, we aren't in a good position to affirm theories of consciousness with a high degree of confidence. Though, truth be told, I'm not totally convinced that we have a genuine mystery on our hands. That's why I'm actively exploring panpsychist and dualist accounts of mind and matter instead of doing something else. But here's one reason I'm attracted to Mysterianism. A, we know there are mysteries, and B, we have arguably not made a ton of progress on deciding which metaphysical theory of consciousness, if any, is actually true. If consciousness and its place in nature is a genuine mystery, then the lack of concrete progress is to be expected. Mysterianism would cleanly explain why we've moved past vitalism, but haven't been able to move past the same materialist versus dualist versus panpsychist versus idealist debates that were taking place centuries ago. So I'm making what could be considered two distinct arguments here: pessimistic induction and inference to the best explanation. As for the latter, we can safely say that Mysterianism would predict the gargantuan fray of conflicting theories that never seem to resolve into a stable consensus. There are ephemeral trends, but any survey of the history of the metaphysics of consciousness will reveal an ebb and flow of opinion that never seems to find equilibrium. This is to be expected on a Mysterian view, so one might inductively infer from this history that no stable answer will be reached, and they might add that this failure of significant progress is better predicted by the Mysterian hypothesis. Eric Schwitzgebel argues that the reason we haven't made the kind of progress one might have hoped for is that we have no reliable guide. No matter which side you take, it's impossible to avoid doing violence to common sense at some point, and abstract reasoning can't seem to lead to a convergence. Furthermore, science isn't as helpful as usual. Quote, certain fundamental questions about the metaphysics of mind can't, it seems, be settled by science in anything like its current state, or by abstract reasoning. To address these questions, we must turn to common sense. If then we have good reason to think that common sense, too, is no reliable guide, we are unmoored. Without common sense as a constraint, the possibilities open up, bizarre and beautiful in their different ways. And once open, they refuse to shut. End quote. In a review of Luke Roloff's book on panpsychism, Combining Minds, Schwitzgebel commented, if there's one thing we know about the metaphysics of consciousness, it's that something bizarre must be true. Among the reasons to think so, every well-developed theory of consciousness in the entire history of written philosophy on Earth has either been radically bizarre on its face or had radically bizarre consequences. Many of these theories, he adds, seem to leave common sense farther behind the more specific they become, leading him to the conclusion that no non-bizarre general theory of consciousness is available and, he suspects, not even constructible in principle. He argues that the truth in the metaphysics of mind is bound to be contrary to common sense, and that we would not feel compelled to believe the right answer if it was staring us in the face. Quote, "Something crazy must be among the core truths about the metaphysics of mind." End quote. So here's one final reason one might be attracted to Mysterianism. There are a few we haven't covered. For instance, there's a completely different path to Mysterianism developed by Shane Wagner, but I'll leave a link in the description to his blog post. Again, it's a completely different path to Mysterianism than any of the ones I've been outlining. Another version of the view can rest on a foundation of agnosticism. Many theories of consciousness, as Philip Goff explains, quote, "are empirically equivalent. There is no experiment that can decide between them." That's not really a surprise, as this is not a purely empirical question. It's rather a question of why something that is publicly observable, brain activity, always goes together with something that is not publicly observable, subjective experience. This isn't the kind of question that an experiment can answer, just as questions about the fundamental character of ethics can't be answered experimentally. One option is agnosticism. If we can't decide between these views experimentally, then maybe we should simply say that we don't know which is true. End quote. It seems as if there's no really objective way of settling this debate, and it's unclear whether the non-empirical resources we do have at our disposal are adequate to establish a significant credence in any metaphysical theory of consciousness. It's not that theory A can't be significantly more probable than theory B. Our credence in theory A can be high relative to some competitor, but not high in any absolute sense. There's just not much to work from. If no publicly available data can settle the issue, and no philosophical method seems able to yield any degree of intersubjective agreement, then maybe we should consider the idea that we're unable to solve the problem, or just asking bad questions. Echoes of this can be found in Schwitzgebel's case discussed earlier, but Goff is far more optimistic about the possibility of using reason to resolve the problem and reach an intelligible and satisfying theory of consciousness. And I tentatively share Goff's optimism, as I'm not ready to give up and embrace the mystery quite yet, but we should still heed the words of biologist J.B.S. Haldane, who said in 1927, "Now my suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. I have read and heard many attempts at a systematic account of it, from materialism and theosophy to the Christian system or that of Kant, and I have always felt that they were much too simple. I suspect that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of, or can be dreamed of, in any philosophy." On the one hand, Haldane and Chomsky are undeniably correct, but the issue of identifying mysteries in practice is what worries me. What if Mysterianism is a self-fulfilling prophecy? What if we're discouraging people from seeking answers when there are answers out there to be found? For now, I'll keep pursuing my various non-physicalist interests. If those lead me to the same dead end that physicalism led me to, then I'll add this to the list of things Noam Chomsky was right about. Thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll talk to you next time.